Welcome to Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Claire Parsons, a research assistant for the CDA Institute. Joining me today are three generals with a breadth of experience both in the air and as policymakers. Retired Major General Colin Keiver has over 30 years of Royal Canadian Air Force experience and served as the deputy commander of the RCAF. He aided in the development of both Strong Secure Engaged and the NORAD Modernization Project. He is now a consultant with CFN Consulting. We are also joined by retired Lieutenant Governor Andre Deschamps, former commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force and current CFN consultant. General Deschamps helped guide the RCAF through some of its most intense operational and acquisitional times. Lastly, we are joined by former Chief of Defense Staff General Tom Lawson, whose range of experience has been a boon to the Air Force. Today, we talked about the F-35 fighter jet procurement and the deal with the Americans hanging in the balance. Our experts highlight the need for more efficient and depoliticized procurement processes, stressing the need for more infrastructure and personnel in addition to equipment. They touch upon how the Canadian relationship with the Americans ebbs and flows, but that our reliance on the Americans is not something that Canada can surrender suddenly. What can Canada do to repatriate Canadian defense? What happens if the F-35 deal goes down? Will Canada diversify its defense relationships? Our guests have answers. This is Expert Series. First and foremost, thank you for joining us on the program today. We're here talking about the potential of the F-35 procurement deal um, to either be readjusted or canceled, according to both announcements by the Liberal Party this week, but also several other parties um, who are looking to sort of compete on the electoral stage. So I think it's best that we start with the elephant in the room. With the snap election called, defense experts are wondering whether this is the election that will bring defense and security issues to the forefront and contribute to the voting behaviors of Canadians. The F-35 has been in the news. It's been one of the major headlines. Is this the election that's going to really bring defense to the forefront? And which defense and security issues do you think will catch the eye of the public if there are any?
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll start on that. We're here to talk about the F-35, but keeping it general allows us probably to agree that it's very heartening to anybody that's interested in defense and security for our nation, and more broadly than that for NATO and some of our bigger partnerships. That it is becoming more and more likely that each of the political parties will be making defense and security a plank in their campaigns. We haven't seen that for many years. And it's not just because of what's happening south of the border, but because what's happening around the world. Peer competitors are becoming more aggressive, and Canadians are perceiving that. There have been a lot of articles in the paper about the plight that the Canadian Armed Forces find themselves in by being very short of operationally trained members. And all of these things have kind of added to a sense amongst the Canadian populace that defense has to be invested in. And then we've got what's happening south of the border. And then we've got an election. You put all of those things together, and I think the answer to your question is yes. For the first time in several elections, if not in recent memory, this will be a big part of what Canadians are talking about, and those officials who hope to be elected will be talking about.
I think I would just add to that, that I think, it's significant that both the leading contenders have committed to costed proposals out of the Parliamentary Budget Office. And when we see those proposals drop, I think that's what I'm watching for is, what do we see in there for actual funding lines and dollars committed? And, to your question about what is it that will catch the eye, interestingly, the commitment to fund the department and the CAF, many of the things they need to do to fund it properly aren't actually shiny, catchy announcements for government. For example, infrastructure recapitalization across the departmental portfolio. We saw Mr. Carney yesterday making an announcement about pay raises for, CAF members and housing and things like that. In other words, they can make significant investment in the department without actually buying any new equipment. And for example, the sewage treatment plant in Cold Lake right now is under emergency management protocols by the province of Alberta because it's in imminent danger of failure. So, without that kind of investment, there's a high probability that the new hangars they're building for F-35s or whatever they might procure has porta potties in the parking lot because the sewage treatment plant hasn't been recapitalized in 50, 60 years. So you've got a massive portfolio that requires significant investment just in order to make it whole. So I'm really looking for the funding packages that are attached to those cost proposals.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, of course, is, as Tom pointed out, is a convergence of multiple issues that have ignited, interest around defense matters, only as they relate to Canada's political relevance in either the North American partnership or across Europe. Typically, governments hate to bring defense into an election discussion. It's never a winning hand for most governments. Therefore, it's reluctant. They typically reluctantly do so. And more specifically, the F-35 has been the shiny object that's been dragged out in just about every election since 2008 as a point of contention. So not surprising that yet again, as political uncertainty erupts in North America, and then of course here in Canada, as we try to find our footing, the F-35 file again has been dragged into the spotlight as a controversy, as a whether Canada needs it, doesn't need it, should we do something else? Nothing new here, except the fact that we're committed to the program as of 2 years ago. We've put billions of dollars downrange to, acquire the platform, start conversion training, build infrastructure. So it's kind of get a bit late in the day to have cold feet. Uh, Governments will do what they need to do to find level ground for themselves as far as giving themselves some strategic space to make decisions. Doesn't mean they're not going to change directions. Governments have done so before in the past. But from a military perspective, it would be very, poor choice, if I could put it that way, to either change course, go to neutral, go to plan B, worst time possible to make those kind of decisions when you're already embarked on a transition program. You don't have a lot of good options as far as plan Bs, and your current fleet is aging out, period stop. There's only so much you can do to keep the legacy fleet viable and safe. Both are important. And changing our mind constantly will not help that problem space. So tough spot for the government. Clearly, the government's not willing to make any final pronouncements until they're elected a new government. So they have a mandate to negotiate with the U.S. and make hopefully better choices as we go forward with a renewed alliance with the United States. But a lot of uncertainty, both economic and, of course, security. As we've seen the last day or so, more chaos in the U.S. administration on their own internal processes, security matters. It's not a calm time to make decisions. So the F-35 caught in the crosshairs yet again. Hopefully, we'll get on the other side and still see that we have a commitment to this program because it is pretty core for the RCAF as far as having a relevant combat capability going into the 21st century. So I think I'll leave it at that. There's optionalities maybe, but at the end of the day, it's really about having a relevant air force going into the end of this decade. If we're not committed to that, I think we're going to be in trouble.
It's been abundantly clear from our CAF that the F-35 is the match that they are looking for. But when we're talking about electoral issues in this cycle, it's pretty unquestionable that the Canada-US relationship is going to be the dominant issue of the election. And Canadians, for the first time, uh, have a public opinion on which kind of equipment that the Canadian military is looking to purchase because it's related to the Canada-US relationship. Canadians tend to be in a couple of camps dependent on the US trade war, that any kind of commercial engagement with the United States is a national security threat, and that the other camp is arguing that by continually engaging in trade, perhaps by going through with the F-35 acquisition, that the Americans will settle, and it'll appease the concerns that the American administration has. Um, what can be done either from a political perspective or even from a military perspective to address both camps' concerns, as some Canadians not wanting to engage with the Americans um, due to diplomatic mistreatment, and also simultaneously, appease an ally that we've had for a century?
There's a lot there to unpack, Claire. I'll just before I hand it over, maybe just shift something you said there to open up, and that is the clarity with which I think you were indicating that the Air Force, the Canadian Armed Forces, made it regarding the F-35. I don't think that's exactly right. I think if you speak to most fighter pilots over the last 10 or 15 years, ever since the original plan to purchase in 2010 was made, you'd find that most who have looked at the options would lean in that direction. But for quite a period of time here, and both of these gentlemen can shed a bit more light on this. Once that decision was reversed and it was thrown into open competition, the Air Force made very clear what the operational requirement was, and then they were told to back away, just back away. And the surprising thing to those of us who were out of uniform, who spoke with those who were still in uniform, was that they were truly out of it and were making the best plans they could to receive whichever aircraft was selected. I'll just finish that thought by saying, if it had have been the Gripen, which was the other one that ended in the competition alongside the F-35, uh, I th- I think that the Air Force, many, as we're saying here, may have been slightly disappointed with that. In fact, quite disappointed with that, but they were ready to accept it and get on. To speak to something that General Deschamps just said, we're kind of beyond that now. In fact, the nightmare scenario is the one that appears to be on the table from what Mr. Carney's saying, and that is we'll take the first 16 and then look at what other options we've got, which would lead to a mixed fleet of fighters. And this is a nightmare scenario. Every logistician and engineer in the forces would say, with 88 aircraft, do not split, do not have a second fleet. It requires an entire logistical train, engineering support, training system, new technicians, pilots. Don't do that for these numbers. So, just to finish that thought, the RCAF would have been okay, disappointed, but okay with accepting the Griffin if that had been the decision last year. But they're shaking with concern of where this reconsideration might take us.
I would add to that discussion. I think, some excellent points there. And I think, at its heart, I think Canada needs to be strategic and patient here in the sense that let's not conflate security issues with trade issues. In other words, let's not jeopardize national security while getting caught up in a discussion on supply chain management in the dairy sector, for example. They're two very different things. And I think, at the macro level, what's best to defend the nation? We know that the F-35 is the most capable of all the alternatives that are out there. I think we need to be very cognizant of that. And at the end of the day, Canada and the United States have mutually dependent security interests as it relates to the defense of the continent of North America. You can't draw a line down, for example, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and not have a discussion between Canada and the U.S. on how best to protect the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is vital to the commerce of both nations. And the same is true of our airspace and our maritime approaches. It needs to be approached from a continental perspective. And the notion that Canada could somehow leave itself from the United States on these security issues, I think is a little false and a little naive. Yes, have discussions on trade, but I think we need to be cognizant of first principles here and what that means to the security and the defense of the nation. And there are interests there that I think are worth discussing with the United States on in terms of how to keep those interests sacrosanct and principled while having those discussions on trade. And I think conflating them confuses the issue.
Yeah, I think that's the danger right now is as they're dragging in key defense procurement as an example of how we should realign our trade so there's more Canadian content, let's say on defense uh, contracts. Well, it's nothing under the sun. 2015, 2014, 2015, Canada issued a new policy on basically offsets, with the ITV, industrial technical benefits of value proposition policy. And it's been in place since then. And it's been one of the main drivers of competition and beneficial outcomes for Canada. The problem with all that, it takes time. The Prime Minister in the last couple of days made several announcements. Most of those are I guess, already made by previous Liberal government, but he's just making the emphasis that, about the Arctic additional capabilities potentially, the Coast Guard assets. Uh, but at the end of the day, the procurement process is what it is. Although every political party that comes to power talks about streamlining, making it go faster, more efficient. So again, we're hearing pretty much what we've heard in the past about defense procurement. The danger here is we get sort of totally tied down into the policy or the public aspect of this conversation, which is about showing that Canada will do more for itself, more independent activities on the defense side. Uh, the principle's fine. I think the application is where we're going to run into serious trouble. We can't reverse course on 50 years plus of industrial partition of capabilities. Canada is part of several treaties or agreements with the U.S. on defense production. So we can't sort of heave all that over the fence line. We could, but I don't think we can afford to. Canada will not be able to afford to go its own way on multiple fronts as far as defense technologies. In Europe, they have different options. They're geographically capable of operating joint production facilities. They could do things we can't do here in Canada because we are not in Europe. And we are physically tied by 5,000 miles of border with the US, airspace and land. So that's a reality. Our focus should be on showing the US that we are credible partners on the defense of North America. We have not been carrying our fair share of the defense requirements in North America and perhaps elsewhere, but certainly keeping up to the demands that have been put on the new technology in North America. Lots of projects, lots of promises. We're still at 1.4% GDP. So the U.S. frustration is clear. It's been clear in previous administration. It's just more vitriolic under the Trump administration. But at the end of the day, it's kind of our shortfall that we have not addressed. Government's talking about addressing it. That's good. That should be the focus. We're picking up our socks. We are going to deliver better North American defense integration and capabilities. That should be the separate box than the trade business that's currently underway, which is the negotiating tactics. There's all kinds of other agendas. It's hard to untangle from all this. But on the defense side, I think it'd be a far safer track to get on the defense of North America, borders, of course. But the technology integration is absolute if we're going to expect to have an integrated air defense system in North America. So I think we need to pick different rails here with that conversation with the US. If we cross those streams, it'll be very, I think, poor outcome for Canada.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The release of the Australian over the horizon radar system and the agreement between Canada and Australia does indicate a significant investment from Canada in defense, particularly in the Arctic, which has been a massive region of interest for Canada in the past couple of years. Um, but the procurement process is a deeply complicated um, process. It is more complicated than an average government acquisition because of the national security implications. Um, and Canada's procurement of the F-35 is already significantly delayed. Um, we committed 2 years ago, but before that, there was an extensive, 15-year process of political negotiation. Um, what can we learn either from our European allies who have the geographical advantage that permits them to engage in more efficient procurement or even from the Americans? And what can Canada learn on how to improve our procurement process so that we avoid another tumultuous acquisition like the F-35?
I'll just start on that, Claire. And I think we can take from some of our partners a lesson against the wedge issue that can be turned, any of these procurements can be turned into. As we may remember, it was the Liberal government back in the 90s that began our participation in the partnership on the F-35. The Conservatives took that over and pretty much decided it would be the F-35 that we would buy, and then turned it into a wedge issue. Instead of congratulating the Liberals on where they had brought the project and ride on their coattails to smooth this thing through, they made it very clear that this was going to be what they stand on, and it became a political issue that then got very embarrassing for the Harper government, and it got turned off. As soon as you find bipartisanship on some of these items, they'll go through very quickly. We've seen a model. Back when soldiers were falling in Afghanistan, purchases went through very quickly for C-17s, for C-130Js, for Nyala armored personnel vehicles, and things like that. I think that our partners in NATO and friends around the world who have been able to move partisanship out of these things can prove that there is a model out there that can be used to speed these things up.
I would add that this is less about procurement and more about politics, Claire. The defense procurement system in any nation works as well as the government of the day wants it to work. And the reality is that where there is a national will and a commitment to national security and defense, then they will find a way to make it happen quickly. To General Lawson's point, C-17, C-130J, all those procurements. Um, Canada signed on as a partner to the F-35 in 1997, 28 years ago. We should have taken delivery of this airplane 10, 12 years ago. And the reason we haven't is because of politics, not because of the procurement system.
Yeah, I mean, we're uh, learning from our allies. One thing I've always admired or found, beneficial, looking at the Australians for instance, they have very sort of vitriolic elections also. They name called, it's they get down and dirty, but they've never fought over defense needs. There's always been bipartisan support for the defense policy and the defense plans. And once that's sort of been discussed in Parliament and they've agreed that they need to do, a list of things, they move on. And no matter what the elections are about, they never go back and sort of nitpick or drag defense issues forward as an election issue. In Canada, we've always done that as a stick because honestly, Canadians tend to see defense with, you know, sort of a jaundiced eye. It's not worthwhile spending. It's a different focus. Then Canada pays attention and does well on procurement is when we're in a crisis. Afghanistan was a case in point. So when external pressure is applied, Canadian government can make decisions and can move things along at a good clip. We are back under the gun. There is a boot on our neck. It is a fairly large one. So we will have to make decisions. Now we're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to keep some options open as they're trying to figure out what aggressiveness they need to take to defense or security at large to at least satisfy, the current U.S. government that we are tracking in the right direction. They're trying to keep some strategic maneuver space with these sort of pronounced. We're going to study fighters and so on. But at the end of the day, there's not a lot of great options out there. I think we should be building on the defense of North America as the subject, not F-35s. And I think that's going to be more productive in the end. OTR is a good example. The government made an announcement, but the media said, "Oh, we bypassed the Americans. We pulled a quick one." Okay, that shouldn't be the message. The message was Canada's willing to lead in something that important in North America. Canada's also responsible to develop the OTHR for polar surveillance. Those are important portfolios. So we should be glad that the U.S. is seeing us in that lead role. So we should be, as opposed to putting a negative spin on it, which is kind of what the media's done, it should be the Canada's leading actually in developing something that doesn't exist right now in North America, which is those kind of long-range sensors that will help North America be safer, and Canada, of course, being part of that. Integrated air defense. The Americans are going, of course, not necessarily all with clarity, but they decided, the president decided that they're going to have basically Iron Dome across the US, or at least in critical areas of the US. Well, Canada better be paying attention. If we're not part of that discussion, there's a big risk for us to be left behind and excluded from some of these critical priorities that the U.S. is putting on for their defense. We better pay attention. So we should be talking about those things. What can Canada do to actually help this move along? We do have the ability to be helpful in that space. So I think that's the path the government should look to pivot to, as opposed to staying in a controversial, confrontational mode on some procurement. And I think that's not going to pay out in the long term. I think they should pivot to the bigger picture.
Yeah, we see a lot of Canadian development, particularly in sensing technology and in a really promising area of defense technology development in Canada is our domain awareness. And air integration will be absolutely essential to that domain awareness, especially as climate change affects the Arctic and we see more transport, particularly through the Northwest Passage. I'm going to ask you to engage in perhaps a unfortunate hypothetical now. Um, as we sort of come to the end of our session here, um, it's been abundantly clear across the panel that if the F-35 deal falls apart, it will be a political failure on behalf of Canadian governance as a whole. Um, and that the acquisition of the F-35 is an overdue process for the Canadian military. What happens if the deal is in fact canceled or significantly delayed, divvied up?
Right. Well, on the second part of this, significantly delayed, it probably won't be the first 16 of those jets. But to your point, if the F-35 procurement were scrapped entirely and reopened, then you bring in all of the concerns that have been stated well by General Keiver and General Deschamps regarding the defense of Canada and our contributions both to NORAD and to NATO. There will be a time probably when the Hornets will have crumbled that we don't have a fighter to put in their place. But I think there's an assumption amongst a lot of Canadians that because the second aircraft or the last one remaining in the competition was the Gripen, that would be the one that you would swing to and very quickly purchase a fleet of those. I'm not sure that that's a solid assumption. I think what we have to do is reopen entirely. To be fair, there might be better options out there. The Rafale, the Eurofighter. I don't know, but likely the RCAF operational requirements wouldn't have changed too much. Although even that would have to be looked at. The fact that those things were written several years ago, you'd start from an open, basic idea that we're allowing this thing to go ahead. On the other hand, and I'll just say this, I'm really interested in what my panelists, co-panelists think about this, but if it's a requirement for Canadian security to get a fighter on the ground as quickly as possible, and it's not going to be the F-35, you can make a decision based on emergency requirements to sole source something, which would be a pivot away from any of what we've seen in terms of procurement policies in recent decades.
This is a fascinating question, Claire, and I think there's a whole layer here that kind of needs to be peeled back. Let's just note that the first F-35 is scheduled to be delivered to Canada in 18 months. 18 months. There is no other alternative that is a new build that is going to be delivered to Canada in 18 months. And the alternatives, what's striking about the alternatives, regardless of what it is, all of them have US interdependencies. Even the Rafale uses GPS, which is a US controlled system for precision navigation and timing. So what sovereignty are we really achieving by switching to something else? Equally as important, all of the alternatives that might be a plan B, for example, all of them are subject to be replaced in service by the 2040 timeframe by next generation air dominance programs that the Europeans are developing, the Americans are developing, et cetera, et cetera. So in a rush to build airplanes in Canada, let's hypothetically say it's the Gripens. And what's interesting is even the Swedes, which have developed the Gripen, have partnered with the UK in the development of a sixth generation program for delivery in 2040. So, in effect, what that means is we would be trading the most modern, most capable fighter aircraft for something else scheduled to be replaced by the rest of the world in the 2035 2040 timeframe. I'm not sure how that makes Canada safer.
Yeah. So we are just, we're not in a position to make good decisions right now, other than reinforcing our partnership with the U.S., notwithstanding the tension between the trade issues. I think that's a very real one. And of course, the absolutely uh, negative retort coming out of the White House about Canada as a 51st state, not helpful, right? Clearly, it's creating anxiety both in the markets and society as to what, it's not a joke anymore. So what does that really mean? So I think that's part of the anxiety is how do we commit to, half a century's worth of partnership with a country that right now is unclear whether they're going to be trustworthy past, the next 3 months as far as, continue to support Canada in a way that needs to be supported on the technology side. However, if it goes south, if things go poorly to the point where the U.S. starts pulling support from Canada from a military technology perspective, there are no great plan Bs. So that's the issue. It's either we find a way of working better together, especially keeping the focus on North America, than trying to carve ourselves into different chunks. So Euro nation chunk, and then try to work up some sort of North American bilat chunk with the U.S. Diversifying our economy is sensible and it's urgent. As we talked about for 30, 40 years. Every time there's a crisis, we talk about it. Not the government to take action now. The pipe, energy ease, all these things that would create more options for the government. That's what they need to focus on. F-35 or not, that is kind of not a same discussion. And at the end of the day, it's not helpful. Certainly not from a military planning perspective. Our weapon systems are American. Our ship, nobody's talking about CSC. That entire combat system's US. Same company that's building F-35. So you can't cherry pick what you think is reliable in your defense capability set if fundamentally we no longer have confidence in our U.S. allies our to be there to support what we acquire from them. That's truly the case. We have a far bigger problem, and a couple $1 billion are not going to solve that. To create independent capabilities would be a fortune of defense expenditure and personnel that we don't have. We willing to start conscripting people. So you got to come back to realities. Okay, we need to find some level ground here. We got to keep the defense portfolio stable as the government looks for political solutions, because we know eventually one will be found. We just don't want to create so much chaos in the defense portfolio that it now creates negative outcomes. We're already at a low readiness level across the Canadian forces. This could be really bad if we start losing time and misdirecting resources towards these uh, policy space development options that they want, as opposed to true military capability that we need deployed. We're already 10 years late. So I think that's the issue for the CAF and D&Ds to try and keep the policy folks, or the politics out of defense procurement as much as they can. We know it's impossible, but to keep the ship going that fairly straight until we can. Buying mixed fleet would be disastrous from a military perspective. We've done it in the past, and we've seen the results. We had 3 different fighter fleets in the 60s and 70s because when we canceled the Arrow, the Air Force had to go and find aircraft that would be able to fill up various roles. They wanted to buy the F-4 because it was multi-role, too expensive. Governments, and it wasn't, there was a Canadian component that could be built stuff in Canada. Well, guess what? Wound up with 3 different fleets, one being the F-5 that was built by Canadair, 104 built by Canadair in Ottawa. It was great. It was a great outcome, but it did not serve the Air Force terribly well because we had 3 fleets to sustain, and they were single type aircraft. They were multi-role. We bought the F-18 to get away from that, to go to multi-role aircraft that could deliver on all those fronts at a far more economic cost. And hopefully we've learned those lessons and don't go backwards. We need to keep going into that forward space with that kind of mindset.
So there's a point that needs to be made too, Claire, about the F-35, and there's a lot of discussion right now about, oh, what if the US cuts this off? And the software is the one that's raging in discussions right now. What's fascinating about the software is there is nothing anybody buys that does not have vendor software on it. I mean, the iPhone you buy has vendor software on it. That doesn't mean you can't use it however you want, and it doesn't mean you can't load whatever apps you want on it. I mean, this is the reality of the modern age. And what's striking about the F-35 is the vendor software that's on the F-35 is actually what gets put into that software is determined by the Joint Program Office of the F-35 with the partner nation sitting at the table voting about what goes into the next software load, on the F-35. And Canada, as a partner nation, a tier 3 partner nation, sits at that table and makes that decision about what that vendor software is. So we could talk about supply chain, but the reality is that the United States were to cut off supply chain and spares from Canada. um, well, 50% of the horizontal stabilizers that are used on F-35 production line in Fort Worth, Texas, are delivered from Magellan Aerospace in Winnipeg. They would cut themselves off as well. So there's an intricacy and an interdependency here that I think, quite frankly, the discussions are missing in terms of what F-35 is and isn't. And at the macro level, there's a great historical context here that General Lawson alluded to. Um, in 1953, when Canada started the Arrow program, which was canceled and led to those other fighters, Canada was spending 7.4% of GDP on defense. In 1959, when we canceled the Arrow program, Canada was spending 4.4% of GDP on defense. By 1969, it was down to 2.1%, and it's never gone above that since. Today, we spend about 1.36% GDP on defense. Canada can do whatever it wants from a sovereign perspective, but it needs to pay for it. And that is the real discussion here. What is and is not important to Canada from a national security perspective, and what is it willing to pay for? Because this is much bigger than whether or not we discuss which fighter airplane we're going to buy.
Some absolutely fantastic insights on the broader national identity aspects of a decision like the F-35. We're coming up on the end of time here, so I'm going to open up the panel for final words. Consider this period a time to touch on any thoughts you had that you didn't get an opportunity to speak on, or anything you would like our listeners to know broadly about the F-35 and the defense procurement process. I open the floor to you.
Thanks, Claire. That the only thought I think I would add, and it would probably be echoing points we've already made, that is that we find ourselves in this unique discussion right now that we did not expect to find ourselves in, and we should recognize over and over and over that we've been placed in it. We've been forced, we've been coerced into this policy set of policy decisions based on the rapid realignment of a friend and ally into something at least mercurial and perhaps even malicious. That's not Canada's fault. Everybody understands why we're having this discussion. I think the important part of what's come out today is that you've got to separate some of that from the decisions that need to be made to protect Canada and move ahead. Um, I think it's important that policies are developed in coming months that continue to keep pressure on the United States in various ways. But doing it through the military procurement system throws so many other variables into concern that I think the suggestions we hear today is this may not be the area in which we want to develop leverage.
I would add, Claire, I think, I kind of see this as Canada growing up and deciding what it wants to be when it grows up, honestly, in terms of what's happening with our neighbor to the south. We've gotten kind of reliant and taken it for granted for a lot of years. And I think Canadians are right to question what that means. And I hope it means that Canada's about to put its big boy pants on and make some big decisions. I think that's awesome. But it does speak to Canada needing to be strategic. And so in this regard, I think it's not about the fighter airplane. It's about carving out what we want to be sovereign and then recognizing you got to pay to play, if you're going to be sovereign. And I think what I'm hearing is a discussion that is maturing and evolving. And for example, we heard Prime Minister Carney yesterday mentioned that maybe the way ahead is to partner with allies on the next generation of fighting aircraft, in terms of whether that be European or whatever it is. So I think it's those kind of things. How do I invest in the future to ensure that Canada is a safe, secure, reliable partner with all of the world, and while figuring out how to carve out where we can independence and autonomy with the United States, but while absolutely recognizing we have shared interests that we've got to absolutely consider, given the fact we share the same continent and always will.
Yeah, I think everybody's made the right points. The F-35 should not be dragged out as another example of procurement dysfunction. I think it's been beat to death for 15 years. We've picked the platform that suits the Air Force best. Whether or not the government, carries on that path is their decision. However, the consequences of taking a different path will be significant, and I think they need to be aware of that. It's not a easy to reverse process. And again, what are you trying to achieve as far as your sovereignty goals? But the government's talked about, there's lots of stuff on the table, submarines, okay, well, go buy some. And we've talked about it. The last government, this government, they don't put numbers to it. They haven't put, is it 6, 8, when? So they need to, and we've been talking about this for a couple of years. So this is where they need to put more muscle behind the when and how much and commit. Because it's great to make announceables, but they need to proceed to actual execution. There's big money to be put immediately to defense to shore up the crumbling sustainment aspect, the infrastructure, the personnel pillars that are weakened by a shortfall of personnel, recruiting, training system, munitions. There's a whole bunch of immediate pressures, notwithstanding of technology down the road, that need to be invested in today. So they could probably get pretty close to 2% if they start putting immediate money towards all those shortfalls that are currently systemic inside of the D&D forces. If they don't do that, whatever you build on top of that will crumble. So that's immediate. They could do that tomorrow, next budget. Now, whether they can execute at speed because of the shortage of human resources, construction companies, there's other limiting factors, but I think that should be an immediate priority. And then on top of that, then have clear objectives as far as procurement, what needs to be done fastest, at the earliest opportunity, and put resources towards that. So there's a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done here to be effective beyond policy statements. And I think that's the challenge right now for the new government in the next month or so, is to come back with a very clearly articulated strategy of delivery as opposed to policy statements and broad goals. Because we've heard those before. There's been some progress, but it's very slow and incremental, and that's not going to be good enough given the environment we're in right now.
Some fantastic commentary from our experts today, retired generals Tom Lawson, Colin Keiver, and Andre Deschamps. Thank you, sirs, for your recommendation and insights, and as always, for your service. Thank you for joining us on Expert Series today.
That brings us to the end of this pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening. We hope you'll be tuning in next time.